Oh, yeah? We're actually going to get all the way through an act tonight, a complete act in one night. It's unbelievable. All right. And the women must have known that there are no women's parts tonight. We're going to read Act 1, Scene 1. Who wants to be who? Act 2, Scene 1, I'm sorry. There's Gonzalo, Alonso, Sebastian, Antonio, and the bit part, Adrian. I'll take the Adrian part. All right. Who wants to be Sebastian, and who wants to be Antonio? Paul, do you want to be Sebastian? Or Larry, you want to be Antonio? I think that should cover it all. Oh, no, there's a Francisco. Maybe somebody else should be. You got a book? Nobody here doesn't have a book. Well, why don't you be Adrian, and I will take Francisco. Yeah. Adrian can be a woman's part, too. All right, Gonzalo leads off. Who's Alonzo? We don't have it on. All right, I'll be Alonzo. Prithee, peace.
He receives comfort like a cold porridge. The visitor will not give him more so. Look, he's winding up the watch of his wrist. By and by, a hoop strike. One, hell. Taken it wiselier than I meant I should, than I meant you should.
Oh, I'm Alonzo. That's right. All right. I prithee, spare.
They will be talking. Done. The wager? A match. So you're paid. Yes? Aye, and the subtle, as he most learnedly delivered. As if it had lungs and rotten ones. Of that there's none or little. With an eye of greening. No, he doth but mistake the truth totally. As many vouchsafed rarities are. if he had said, widower Aeneas, too? Good Lord, how do you take it?
Widow Dido said, you may be studying that. She was the Carthage, not Tunis.
This Tunis,
Carthage?
his word is more than a miraculous art.
He hath raised the wall, and houses too.
What impossible matter will he make easy next?
I think he will carry this island home in his pocket and give it to his son for an apple.
And sowing the kernels of it in the sea, bring forth more islands. Why, in good time. Sir, we were talking with our Albert Steve that it was fresh when we were at Tunis and the marriage of your daughter, you said. And the rarest that ever came there.
Aid, I beseech you, widow Dido.
Oh, widow Dido, widow Dido. Is not, sir, my number as fresh as the first day I bore it. I mean, his sword. That sword was well fished for. When I bore it in your daughter's marriage. You cram these words into my ears against the stomach of my sense. Would I had never married my daughter there, for coming thence my son is lost, and in my rage she too, who is so far from Italy removed, and ne'er again shall see her. For thou, fine hair, of Naples and of Milan, what strange fish hath made his meal on thee?
Sir, he may live. I saw him beat the surges under him and ride upon their backs. He trod the water whose enmity he flung aside, and breasted the surge more swollen that he met. His bold head 'bove the contentious waves he kept, and oared himself with his good arms in lusty stroke to the shore that o'er his wave-worn basis bowed, as stooped to relieve him. I not doubt he came alive to land.
He's gone.
Sir, you may thank yourself for this greater loss. It would not bless our Europe with your daughter. I'd rather lose her to an African, where she at least is banished from your eye, who hath cause to wet the grief hereon.
Really, peace.
You were nailed to it and importuned otherwise by all of us, and the fair soul herself waited between loathness and obedience. At which end of the beam should bow? We have lost your son, I fear forever. Milan and Naples have more widows in them of this business making than we bring men to comfort them. The fault's your own.
So is the dearest of the lost. I must ask you, the truth you speak that blackness of witness, time to speak of it, rub the snow, and you should bring the dust.
Very well.
And most, Gerard, he's a surgeon. It is foul weather is always,
Foul weather?
very foul. And I plantation is not over. He's sown it with apple seed.
No docks or mallows.
And let me not talk what I do.
Escape being drunk for want of wine.
I come, I would, by contraries, execute all things. For no kind of traffic do I admit, no name of magistrate. That is should not be done, which is policy. Use of service none. Contract succession and glory, and the land, filth, vineyard none. No use of metal, corn, or wine or oil, no occupation. All men like and fall, and women too, but this pure, no suffering.
Yet he would be king of it.
The latter end of this commonwealth forgets the beginning. All things in common nature should produce without slender endeavor. Feast, felony, sword, fight, knife, gun, or even any engine, would I not have. But nature should bring forth, of its own kind, all voices, all notes, like the sea.
No marrying amongst his subjects?
None, man,
Save his majesty.
Long live Gonzalo. Prithee, no more. Thou dost talk nothing to me. Twas you who we laughed at. This kind of very so you may continue. Love me still. What a blow was there given.
And it had not fallen flat long.
There isn't any spoken part, just the music
We
playing.
would so, and then go a bat fowling.
Nay, good my lord, be not angry. No, I mark you. I will not avenge your light discretion so without this glory. Go sleep and hear us.
Will all so soon asleep. I wish mine eyes would with themselves shut up my thoughts. I find they are inclined to do so.
Pleasing sir, do not omit the heavy offer of it. It seldom visits sorrow. When it doth, it is a comfort.
We too, my lord, will guard your person while you take your rest, and watch for safety.
Thank you. Wonder is heavy.
What a strange drowsiness possesses it.
It's the quality of the climate.
Why? Doth it not then our eyelids sink? I find not myself disposed to sleep.
Your eyes, I suppose, are nimble. They fell together all as by consent. They dropped as by a thunderstroke. What night, worthy Sebastian, what night? O Lord, yet methinks I see it in thy face, for thou shouldst be, the occasion speak thee, and thy strong imagination sees a crown dropping upon thy head.
What? Art thou waking?
Do you not hear me speak?
I do. And surely it is a sleepy language, and thou speakest out of thy sleep. What is it thou dost say? This is a strange repose, to be asleep, with eyes wide open, standing, speaking, moving, yet so fast asleep.
Noble Sebastian, thou let's thy fortune sleep, die rather, weeks, while thou art awake.
Thou dost snore distinctly. There's meaning in thy snore.
I am more serious than my custom. You must be so too. Which to do troubles the oar.
Well, I am standing water.
I'll teach you how to flow.
Do so. To ebb, heredity slots, instructs me.
Oh, you but knew how you the purpose cherish while thus you mock it, how in stripping it you more invest it. Having been indeed most often, it is so near the bottom that by their own fear or sloth.
Prithee, say on. The setting of thine eye and cheek proclaim a matter from thee, and a birth indeed, which throws thee much to yield.
Thus then, allow this Lord of the sweet remembrance, this who shall be of true memory when he is cursed, hath here almost persuaded, for he conspired persuasion, only professes to persuade, the king's sons alive. It is as impossible that he's undrowned as he that sleeps near swims.
I have no hope that he's undrowned.
Oh, out of that no hope. What great hope have you? No hope that way is another way, and so high a hope that even ambition cannot pierce a wing beyond, but thou discovered here. Will you grant with me that Ferdinand is crowned?
He's gone.
Then tell me, who's the next heir in Naples?
Clarabelle.
She that is queen of Tunis, she that dwells 10 leagues beyond Venice.
brother's daughter, Queen of Tunis. So she is heir of Naples, twixt regions. There is some space.
The space was every cubit seems to cry out, how shall that Carmel measure us back to Naples? Keep in Tunis, and let Damascus wait. Say this were death, that now hath seized him wife. They would know worse than now they are. There be that can rule Naples as well as he that sleeps. Lords that can create as amply and unnecessarily as this Koepsel. I myself could make him cough as deep chat. Oh, what you bore in the mind that I do. Put asleep for this, for your advancements. Do you understand me?
Methinks I do.
And how does your content hinder your own good fortune?
I remember you did supplant your brother Prospero.
True. And look how well my garments sit upon me, much neater than before. My brother's servants were then my fellows, now they are my men.
But for your conscience,
Acer, where lies that? If for a kite, I would put me to my slipper, but I feel not this deity in my bosom. 20 consciences that stand with me in Helen. Candied be they and melt ere they molest. Here lies your brother, no better than the earth he lies upon. If he were that which now he's like, that's dead. Wounds I with this obedient steel, 3 inches of it, can lay to men forever. Whilst you, doing thus, to perpetual weight for I may put this ancient morsel, this certain prudence, who should not upbraid our course. For all the rest, they'll take the suggestion as a cat laps the milk. They'll tell the flock to any business that we say befits the hour.
thy case, dear friend, shall be my precedent. As thou gottst Milan, I'll come by Naples. Draw thy sword. One stroke shall free thee from the tribute which thou payest, and I, the king, shall love thee.
Drawn together, when I rear my hand, do you delight fallen on Koepsel?
Oh, but one word.
My master through his art foresees the danger that you, his friend, are in, and sends me forth, for else his project dies, to keep them living. While you here do snoring lie, open-eyed conspiracy, his time doth take. If life you keep a care, shake off slumber and beware, awake, awake.
Then let us be set.
What? You're the next one, too. You jumped there. You're Gonzalo.
While we stood here secure in your repose, even now we heard a hollow voice that burst of bellowing, like bulls, or rather lions. Did it not wake you? It struck my ear most terribly.
I heard nothing.
Oh, it was a din to fright a monster's ear, to make an earthquake. Sure, it was the roar of a whole herd of lions.
Heard you this, Gonzalo? Lead off this ground and let's make further search for my poor son. Lead away. Prospero, my lord, shall know what I have done. So, king, go safely on to seek thy son. All right. There are not an abundance of topics for students of mysticism in this part, but there are a few that ought to last for at least 3 hours worth of talking. Chief among them is in the first part of this scene, and that is the matter of attitude. we do not know how much we are subject to habitual attitudes. And what attitudes do for our lives. As candidates to mystery schools, we are told to look for the good. We're not told to fantasize or to pretend that something is what it isn't. We're told to look for the good that is, or for the good that is in things as they are. The positive part of reality. What we pay attention to and how we pay attention to it determines what we get out of an experience, often what the experience itself will become. Gonzalo always looks for the good and finds it. Antonio and Sebastian, I should thumb my nose at him, they can't see what he sees. They see barrenness and bleakness where he sees a beautiful and pleasant situation. It would be easy to call them doomsayers or depressives or something like that, but clearly they're negative and cynical or pessimistic. As they see themselves in our world, they would probably call themselves realists. That's usually what the pessimists do. But the attitude that the people have very much changes their experience. The color of the grass, climate, even the state of their clothes is a matter of debate. You cannot tell from the dialogue whether it is who is right or whether it even is a matter to be contested. The reality of the dialogue is such that there are two completely different views of reality. The debate in this play is not settled. This kind of debate rarely is settled. It goes on and on and on. Pessimists still see darkness. Even if there is a positive outcome, they're still waiting for the doom to come down. And the optimists see positive opportunities even in disasters. This doesn't mean that there isn't a place in the world for caution. And it doesn't mean that there is such a thing, that there isn't such a thing as folly or false optimism. Both are possibilities. Both are things that people can fall into. But both of them are not the same thing as looking for the good. When one identifies with an attitude and invests oneself in an attitude, it is exceedingly hard to free oneself from the attitude, from being controlled by the attitude. So it's very rare that a person can experience an attitude in freedom. We identify ourselves all the time with how we feel, or maybe with a constant attitude that we carry about almost anything. It's easy to get hooked on attitudes because we don't have a strong identity in ourselves. And lacking an identity in ourselves, we'll grasp onto anything. Just recently when I retired, I learned how much I identified myself with my activities. And it was a great liberating experience to see that I was still I, despite the fact that those activities were no longer there. So we're afraid of losing ourselves if we lose our pet attitudes, because that's how we know that we are. Some people wear tight clothes because they know that they're there, because they can feel themselves in the tight clothes. I don't know anybody like that, but there are a few people that do that. But it's just what we need to do. It doesn't mean that we have to dismiss all attitudes, because we do need them to experience reality. I don't even know if it's possible to dismiss an attitude. But we can purge and purify attitudes from personal attachment and just use them as tools to appreciate and to create reality. It must be nice to write a play where you can actually create an attitude and produce a reality out of it. It is difficult to free ourselves from our particular attitudes so that we can appreciate the complementary attitudes that others may have. It's very difficult to even discuss a philosophy of attitude, because usually it begins by somebody telling somebody else, "You're negative." The discussion of attitude starts off on a bad foot right away. Despite all of these difficulties, the fact is that if we are positive about the possibility of there being benign facts, we're much more likely to see them than if we have a closed negative attitude and don't believe that they exist. We can suggest to ourselves that something doesn't exist, like when something is lost, and that item might be right in our field of vision and we don't see it because we have suggested to ourselves lost. We have that negative kind of attitude. Of course, if we are open and see those positive facts, a pessimist can counter and say that, if a person is desperate and their survival depends upon it, no matter how negative they are as a means to keep alive, they're going to see the facts. And that caution and care are important to survival. The pessimist might also say, you positive people are likely to become overconfident or careless and overlook the facts and not see them. So there's something that can be said from both points of view. It's a difficult matter, but open is still open, and closed is still closed, and improvement depends on the belief, possibility of improving, that things can be made better, and that the ability to make them better lies in us. We can only do that if we operate from beyond attitudes and use attitudes as tool. Purify them and use them that way. Now it's true that as much as he's given a chance, Gonzalo does become a little excessive in his optimism when he's describing his utopia. And he waxes, I guess you'd say he even has a laissez-faire attitude toward everything. Utopianism is itself Jupiter Uranus kind of thing. There's all kinds of optimism in it. Gonzalo seems to be trying too hard. And in doing that, that's not out of character. Shakespeare seems to be defining that type of a character. The cynics chime in, and they would have him sowing nettles and docks and other things that are called noxious weeds. The ones that were considered noxious weeds in Shakespeare's time are still considered noxious weeds. What? Yeah, that's right. because the fact of the matter is that the noxious weeds that are mentioned there are very healthful herbs. They're helpful for a person who consumes them, and they're helpful for the environment. Nettles specialize a lot of iron. And you plant nettles in a place for a long time. You can even use a tea made out of nettle leaves to bring iron. Spraying it on other plants, it brings them iron, and they become healthier plants. Now, one way of looking at this thing is that he's spoofing utopianism, and in another way, it is like seeking a Garden of Eden, a return to some pure, innocent state where everything is positive. Because that's just what he would have. No cultivation, anything like this. His adversaries contradict him. They always do, and they challenge him. And he comes up with something really, like he catches them in their own plot. He said, I was only giving you something to laugh at. And that's just what he did, and he even swallowed his own pride, and so it was all a very positive thing. Even when they try to challenge him and say, that isn't manly of you to do that, he said, so what? It worked. You were all laughing. So in the last analysis, he does get the better of the deal. And there is I used to have a copy of it, but there's a very lovely box score, like the box score of a baseball game. I can do it here really quickly. It's like saying that the pessimists score points all along the way, but when it comes down to the final total, the optimists end up winning the whole shebang. And it's that kind of attitude. I'm even in favor of Pollyannaism. I'm having to fight my character all the time because I have quadruple negative. My sun, my moon, my ascendant, and the ruler of the ascendant are all negative, and I tend to be terribly critical and carping. That's a very interesting thing if you try to do some dramatic analysis of this scene, because it goes nowhere. Everything that happens in this scene happens only in this scene, and it isn't developed any further. In fact, some might even think that this scene was nothing but wasted space filler or wasted time filler. But it isn't that. Among other things, Shakespeare is very carefully building characters. And this is done in the jesting, in the badinage, or the persiflage, with Sebastian and Antonio coming down on Gonzalo. Gonzalo is a bit of a clown, and he is a bit of a fool, but he is kind, he's positive, and he's willing to sacrifice himself for others. Clearly, he eventually does, in his folly, prove himself to be more clever than his detractors realize. In fact, that's a good way to get away with things. If you can always do things in a spoofing, jesting way, people will always think it was luck. That you're not clever at all. It's sort of like the universal dumb blonde approach toward life is to have a Pollyanna kind of optimism. However, his adversaries in this scene, Sebastian and Antonio, are mean-spirited. They mock him, and they make fun of him. Now, if one were playing these roles, there are several ways they could be played. You could say that they're just joshing him in fun, but it seems to me that they are not just jesting. They're nasty. This scene is like life, especially if you're going to be an actor that's going to be interpreting it, because it's subtle. Because often in life, we can't tell whether somebody is just jesting or teasing or whether there is a serious element in it. So this again shows a late play by Shakespeare having all kinds of subtlety in it, because he can produce roles that are ambiguous and that are on the edge of tilting one way or the other. And that's very different than like the early plays. Like if you take something like Titus Andronicus, there the people stand out almost like cardboard figures. Now the last half of this scene, or basically the whole scene, I guess, has a number of enigmas in it. Like the falling asleep. When Ariel comes along and causes everybody to fall asleep. Now that seems like a theatrical contrivance. It seems like a cheap way to set the scene for something. It could have been that Antonio and Sebastian were just left on stage alone, and then later bumped into the others and tried to kill them. Why have Ariel come in and have the people put to sleep? Taken at face value, it looks as if it were a setup. However, if you wanted to be really looking into it, I guess you could say you could take it at face value. And you could say, like they say that just men sleep easily. On the other hand, you could say, from the way this scene is set up, that ambition and desire and treachery never sleep. They're always awake and alert with that nervous kind of consciousness. Then there's the question of what's in this for Antonio. It is true that after Sebastian has agreed to things, that Sebastian then promises to relieve him of the tribute. But that's always in question, because Milan is always a dukedom, and Naples is always a kingdom. And then there's that very uncomfortable fact that the person who has promised you something has been part of a conspiracy with you, and there is that well-known statement about the lower desire world where one desire form fights another. There is no honor among thieves. So as a co-conspirator, he knows for certain that his partner can't be trusted, that this is a snake in the grass. One of the more brilliant parts of the scene is temptation. The sleepers are lying there like temptations, opportunities ripe for the picking. Antonio very skillfully tempts Sebastian. He doesn't say to him, let's kill him and we'll take over the show. He doesn't do that at all, because that would offend someone. If someone is a hypnotist and is trying to get somebody to do something unethical, they don't just command them to do it. They find subtle ways to insinuate themselves into their confidence. And then they suggest. And they do it by gradually appealing to the desire nature of the person so that they are tempted. They foster the desires that they want to foster and strengthen them and brings them out. If you think about it, when one is exposed to any kind of sin, when one is exposed to any kind of crime for the first time, or maybe each ensuing time, there's something like the original temptation in the Garden of Eden. And that temptation was twofold. First, it was stand against the bad guys. That is, be rebellious. The second part of the temptation is an appeal to something wonderful for you. Eat this apple and you will be immortal. And so in this whole scene has a biblical ring about it. We'll see that a little bit more in just as we go on. My personal belief about it is that Shakespeare is intentionally making this whole scene, the whole play, sound biblical. After all, what is repeated here, we have already heard when Prospero has told how he was deposed by his brother, but here it is taken a step further, and it's the idea of brother against brother. And that is precisely the words that Christ uses when he's talking about the end of the earth as we know the earth. That brother will be against brother. And so there is something like a returning to the garden and returning to the original sins, and there is trying to set up some kind of an apocalyptic thing where all the different little vignettes that occur in this play are not really developed. Like in a lot of other plays, there are themes and there are sub-themes, and they develop until there is a crescendo. In this case here, it's almost like a shocking grain or something like that. You have a few shocks, then you pull them all together and you make a stack out of them. And that's the way the play seems to be set up. He's trying to make an apocalyptic thing. At the same time that he's using the words of Christ about brother against brother at the apocalyptic end of things, there is also a showing of the domino theory, you might say, of desires. Desire can never be satisfied, and if one applies to a greedy desire to kill someone else, that leads to another killing, to another killing, to another killing. And so there are echoes of the Abel and Cain fratricide scenario from the Garden of Eden that set off the beginning of our coming into this world that is described by Christ as brother against brother at the end of it. So like all the little bundles are tied together, and they're tied together very neatly. All right. We're ready to read the next scene, which is rather short and rather funny. We have Caliban, Trinculo, and Stefano. I believe that's all of the people that there are. Who would like to be Caliban? All right, he's Caliban. Who would like to be Trinculo? Want to be a Trinculo? All right. And who wants to be Stefano? Roz is right in there for Stefano. All right, let's go. It's only a very few short pages.
All the infections that the sun sums up, bogs, fens, flats, on prosper fall, take him by Ishmael disease. The spirits hear me, and yet I needs must curse. They'll nor pinch, fright me with urgent shows, pinch me, I the mire, nor leave me like firebrand in the dark.
she had a tongue that would hang, would cry to the sailor, "Go hang." She loved not the savor of fish, tar nor pitch, yet a tailor might scratch her wherever she did itch. See, boys, let her go hang. This is a scurvy too, but here's my comfort.
Do not torment me, oh.
What's the matter? Have we devils here? Do you put tricks upon us with salvages of men of in? Ha! I've not escaped drowning to be afeard now of your 4 legs. For it hath been said, as proper a man as ever went on 4 legs cannot make him give ground. And it shall be said so again while Stefano breathes at nostrils.
The spirit torments me, oh.
This is some monster of the isle with 4 legs, who hath got, as I take it, out. Where the devil should he learn our language? I will give him some relief, if it but be for that. If I can recover him and keep him tame, and get to Naples with him, he's a present for any emperor that ever trod on these leather.
Do not torment me, Pippi. I'll bring my wood home faster.
He's in his fit now, and does not talk after the wisest. He shall taste of my bottle. If he hath never drunk wine before, it will go near to remove his fit. If I can recover him and keep him tame, I will take too much for him. He shall pay for him that hath him, and that soundly.
Thou dost me yet but little hurt. Thou wilt anon. I know it by thy trembling. Thou prosper works upon me.
Come, on your ways. Open your mouth. Here's that which will give language to you, cat. Open your mouth. This will shake your shaking. I can tell you, and that soundly. You cannot tell who's your friend. Open your chaps again.
I should know that voice. It should be, but he is drowned. These are devils. Oh, heaven.
4 legs and 2 voices. A most delicate monster. His forward voice now is to speak well of his friend. His backward voice is to utter foul speeches and to detract. If all the wine in my bottle will recover him, I will help his out. Come, amen, I will pour some in thy other mouth. Doth thy other mouth call me? Mercy, mercy, this is a devil and no monster. I will leave him, I have no long spoon.
Stefano, if thou be Stefano, touch me, and speak to me, for I am Trinculo. Be not fear, my good friend Trinculo.
If thou beest Trinculo, come forth. I'll pull thee by the lesser legs. If any be Trinculo's legs, these are they. Thou art very Trinculo indeed. How camest thou to be siege of this mooncalf? Can he net Trinculos?
I took him to be killed with a thunderstroke. But art thou not drowned, Stefano? I hope thou art not drowned. Is the storm overblown? I hid thee under the dead mooncalf's gabardine for fear of the storm. And art thou within, Stefano? Oh, Stefano, to Neapolitan's escaped.
Prithee, do not turn me about. My stomach is not constant.
These be fine things, and if they be not sprites, that's a great God and bears celestial liquor. I will kneel to him.
How didst thou escape? How comest thou hither? Swear by this bottle how thou comest hither. I escaped upon a butt of sack which the sailors heaved overboard by this bottle, which I made of the bark of the tree with mine own hands since I was cast ashore.
I'll swear upon that bottle to be thy true subject, for the liquor is not earthly.
Here, swear then, how thou escapest.
Swim ashore, man, like a duck. I can swim like a duck on this morning.
Here, kiss the book. Though thou canst swim like a duck, thou art neat like a goose.
Oh, Stefano, hast any more of this?
The whole butt, man. My cellar is in a rock by the seaside where my wine is hid. How now, mooncalf? How does thy knock?
It's ague.
Oh, thank you.
Hast thou not dropped from heaven?
Out of the moon, I do assure thee. I was the man of the moon when time was.
I have seen thee in her, and I do adore thee. My mistress showed me thee, and thy dog, and thy bush.
Come, swear to that. Kiss the book. I will furnish it anon with new contents. Swear.
By this good light, this is a very shallow monster. I have feared of him, a very weak monster, mad in word. I was a poor, credulous monster, well-drawn monster in his sin. I'll
show thee every fertile inch of the island. I will kiss thy foot. I pity thee, my God.
By this light, the most perfidious and drunken monster, if I go to sleep, you will always walk.
I'll kiss thy foot. I'll swear myself thy subject.
Come on then, down, and swear.
I shall laugh myself to death with this puppy-headed monster, a most scurvy monster. I can find in my heart to beat him.
Come, kiss.
But that the full monsters in drink, an abominable monster.
I'll show thee the best springs. I'll pluck thee berries. I'll fish for thee and get thee wood enough. A plague upon the tyrant that I serve. I'll bear him no more sticks, but follow thee, thou wondrous man.
A most ridiculous monster, to make a wanderer or drunken.
I prithee, let me bring thee where crabs grow, and I with my long nails will dig thee pignuts. Show thee a jay's nest, and instruct thee how to snare the nimblest marmoset, and I'll bring thee to clustered filberts. Sometimes I'll get thee young scrambles from the rod. Wilt thou go with me?
I prithee now, lead the way, without any more talking. Trinculo, the king, and all our company else being drowned, we will inherit here. Here, bear my bottom, fellow Trinculo, we'll fill him by and by again.
Farewell, master. Farewell, farewell.
A howling monster, a drunken monster.
No more dams I'll make for fish, nor fetch and firing, at requiring, nor scrape or trenchering, nor wash dish. Ban, Caliban, has a new master, get a new man. Freedom, high day, freedom, high day, freedom.
So brave monster, lead the way.
Caliban's opening speech is a restatement of things that we've been saying all along. We have suggested that each of the characters, or each set of characters in this play, represents a different stage of humanity between the gardens, the Garden of Eden and the Garden of Gethsemane. We have suggested that Caliban represents the humanity of the Lemurian epoch just after the fall. Actually, it's a little further on from being right at the fall itself, because degradation has set in, and there has been a substantial interment into materialism. Last time we mentioned the abuse or the preemptive misuse of creativity was responsible for the fall. It would be a misstatement to say that the primary misuse of the creative energy was sexual. The most serious and the most prevalent misuse of it was in magic. We mentioned last time that our creativity was used primarily magically, and that we named the animals using the creative word. Those magical words that we used were not like the symbolic words that we use now that weren't anything like what they meant. They were words of power, and within their sounds they carried power that marshaled the substances of nature. Just as musical tones can be made to pile up iron filings or sand or whatever, or they can be used to shatter things, we had that kind of power that we could put into words. We were guided in that work by angels and other hierarchies. In effect, since we were the human likes that were manifest in this outer world, we were the mouthpieces of the hierarchies in the dense material world where they couldn't function directly. Caliban represents a period in time, or an era in time, when our humanity had sunk a little ways into matter. We had degraded our being into something a bit more bestial. And coetaneous with that, we had lost some of that creative potency. Hence, Caliban still has the tendency to use the creative words, and he uses them as magical curses, but he doesn't have the poop behind them. And so they end up just being curses. His curses would be impotent on somebody like Miranda, who represents an advanced state of humanity, because she has evolved soul power, and that soul power protects her against magic. We are all, at our age of evolution, protected from magic, provided we don't open ourselves to it by extreme assertions of desire or by other extremely selfish actions. Nonetheless, if we look at his curse, it is as much informative as it is entertaining. Part of it briefly, very briefly in a phrase, describes the very thing he's living through. That is the devolution of our misthoughts to becoming illnesses. And illness is the final physical world consequence of wrong thinking, wrong desiring, and wrong acting. So when he wishes Prospero to become an illness, he's describing what happened to all of humanity. The curse of Caliban is the curse that we pronounce on ourselves. He's the one that suffers the illness, and he's the one that is living out of harmony with the cosmos. It is also interesting in an oblique way how his pains are brought to him. They're brought to him by very unpleasant interactions with animals. And all of our desires, the forms that they take in the world, in the desire world, are animal forms. So when he's describing stepping on a hedgehog or being wrapped around by an asp or something like that, he's talking about some of his own desires. It may be so that they manifest in the world as those animals, but he's talking about literally about the forms that his desires and thought forms have taken in the desire world. Caliban is referred to in this passage as moon calf. That further ties him to the Lemurian epoch, which was a recapitulation of the moon period at very distant time. He is also referred to as an Indi, but we'll talk about that in just a few minutes. So the speech of Caliban, that opening speech, is an amazingly accurate, nutshell, symbolic description in a couple of other ways. The Bible tells us that the way of the transgressor is hard. When we sacrifice the high road of expressing our divine creation or our divine creative nature in favor of deeper expression into matter and sensual gratification, we sentence ourselves not in just one act for one moment, but we sentenced ourselves to a much deeper and prolonged existence in matter. So we find out that the way of the transgressor is hard for Caliban because he has to always be gathering wood, which is again very biblical in its nature. He's learning by the sweat of his brow, rather than being a creative being that was singing new evolutionary forms into existence. Now he has to carry things around and lug things around. So the curse of Jehovah was not as such a thing as a curse. It was merely a statement of fact of what the consequence would be of giving up the divine status for a more bestial material status. Once we had committed ourselves to a deeper descent into matter, the divine hierarchies did everything they could to help us, so that we could progress along this new uncharted path and gain as much as we could and sidestep some of the difficulties of it. In the story of Adam and Eve, it says, Adam knew Eve and she bore Seth. The use of the word knew or know is now called carnal knowledge. It is not just a euphemism for sex. In those times, our consciousness of each other was more of a soul consciousness. It's almost like animals can see the spirit of another animal that they're interacting with. They have an inner picture vision. We were so otherworldly, even though we were coming into matter, that the only time that we knew of someone's existence outside of us was in sexual union. And hence, sex came to be known as carnal knowledge. You can see the position that we were in. We were going into a dense material world, and our sensory deficiency was quite exaggerated, because we were going into the material world faster than we were developing sense perception to do well in it. So the hierarchies used various tools, and one of them was very powerful. Social disgrace. Social disgrace is a more powerful deterrent to cocaine use, for example, than any legal means or any bribery or any punishment, because we all need each other, and if we're doing something that's socially disgraceful, the power of all of humanity thinking one way is a very, very powerful force to keep us in line. We were, and we are, moved greatly by strong societal values. The humanity of Lemuria was very awake and aware of moral things and the character, the attitude character things in the desire world, because we were focused in the desire world more than we were focused in the physical. Of course, many of the desires and many of the sensibilities of people in the ancient Lemurian epoch were crude. The hierarchy sensing our insecurities, we were especially having insecurities because we were losing that inner light. They instituted for us a new value system. And that new value system was whatever produced a sensation that awakened us outwardly was considered good. It was to be highly esteemed. So with the power of a value system behind it, this obviously hastened our external awareness. Some of the activities that were given to us to awaken this sensory experience were quite sophisticated. For instance, we're told by the seers, the worthwhile seers, that when we were in female bodies that were receptive and sensitive, our activity was to put ourselves in touch with the forces of nature by very, very carefully attuning ourselves with our perception. Therefore, the understanding of nature, which wasn't understood the way we understand it now with laws and principles or anything like that, it was understood as a feeling, that was in the hands of those incarnated as women. We still have some of those things in quite a few societies to this day. We have cunning women, and we have grandmothers and people who are capable of doing those sort of things. Not all of the activities were that sophisticated. Some of them were quite crude. For instance, when we were in male bodies, there were activities and rituals to experience pain and to bear as much pain as we could bear, and that was considered good. We find some of that still in our times, some of those kinds of societies. We have atavisms, like of fights to the finish, as in boxing, and we have warrior feats of bravery. I haven't been to one of those things, but there is such a thing that in some rituals and rites, people prove their bravery and they prove their masculinity by taking razor blades and cutting and stripping skin off of themselves. And they do this to show the strength of their bravery and basically their commitment of themselves to the values. Caliban represents a state of consciousness that was just a little bit further on. He learns that the way of the transgressor is hard. Part of our original sin, so to speak, was disobedience. We didn't follow what we were told to do. And so Caliban is learning that any time that he isn't obedient, it means pain. He's not so far back that he just worshipped pain for the sake of pain as part of his evolutionary advancement, but he's not so far forward that by putting one pain together or a pleasurable experience together, that he can begin to awaken through memory a mental facility of understanding cause and consequence. So he's somewhere in between those two states. He's at a state where pain and pleasure are about to be aligned with knowledge. So, these things were brought to us to bring us into the material world that we were refusing to come into. So he's experiencing a spectrum of pain, and he's associating it with a spectrum of desire. And that brings us to the final topic of this scene and the final topic of this evening. This is one of those scenes that alcohol and intoxication is brought in, but it's not brought in just out of silliness. It isn't meant to just be a funny thing. The word alcohol is of Arabic derivation. The definition of the word in Arabic is debatable. Some think it means the fine white powder, especially the powder of antimony, that was a carrying agent for certain kinds of spiritual forces when it was in solutions. Some think the word alcohol means the spirit, or the spirits, or the evil spirit. The term came into Europe from the alchemists. The North African alchemists, such as, I'm blanking on my memory now. Al-Kindi, and there's one Aristotelian alchemist skips my memory right now. The organic chemists claim that there is an entire family of alcohols. In inorganic chemistry, there are acids and alkalis, which are highly reactive compounds that come from both extremes of the periodic table. Those extremes of acid and alkali in inorganic chemistry parallel acids and alcohols in organic chemistry. We're interested in just one attribute of alcohol. There are many chemical and alchemical attributes to alcohol, but we're interested in just one, and that is intoxication. Literally, the word intoxication means to take in poison, or to take in a drug which produces stupefaction, drunkenness, or inebriation. While this former definition of poisoning is worthy to consider in terms of health, because alcohol is pretty lethal, it's the second definition that we want to look at. If you look at the dictionary, the definition of intoxication is rather schizophrenic. On one hand, the dictionary says that alcohol is deadening. On the other hand, the dictionary says that it rouses one to excitement. Physiological biochemistry is unambiguous about it. It states that the effect of alcohol is sedative and that it depresses neural function, especially in the brain. They've made very careful studies about it, and the claim is that alcohol in the blood causes stringy blood. Not in the fibrin, but in the red blood corpuscles. They become strung together. And when they're stringy, they can't pass through the very tiny capillaries. And when they can't pass through the tiny capillaries, they, especially in the brain, they cause death of nerves. Because nerves, especially the nerves in the brain, are very sensitive to loss or deprivation of oxygen. In this activity, then, brain cells are starved to death. And the fact of the matter is that the amount of alcohol that is in one shot, or one goblet of wine, or one bottle of beer, kills as many brain cells as 1 day's worth of thinking. Because every time we think, we kill brain cells. So every time you take a drink, you're cutting 1 day's thinking off the other end. And it happens in random places. The sedative effect of alcohol on the dense physical body is very clearly demonstrated in retarded reflexes, poor coordination, and so on. However, this does not explain the rowdy effects of alcohol. Now, you could speculate, if you wanted to, that the alcohol affects the frontal cells more because they don't have as good a supply of blood and therefore as good a supply of oxygen. And the frontal cells have to do with morality and forbearance and inhibition and all of that. And that they would then be more affected, and that the hinder parts of the brain, which are more primal and more survivalistic, would not be affected as much. That doesn't really adequately explain the phenomenon. I can say from my own experience, many years ago, when I used to drink freely, I can remember an instance when I was mildly intoxicated and was playing pool. Normally I was a timid kind of person, but at that degree of intoxication I was confident and I had a lot of daring do to me. And what happened was I made every shot on the pool table that I tried to make. And some of them were difficult shots. And I'm a poor pool player. My coordination should have been worse than normal. The depression of nerve function is not relaxation. When somebody says they need a drink to calm the nerves, that's poppycock. There is no such thing as calming the nerves. Unless you call killing them or deadening them. All of this is just to illustrate that the dictionary is correct in part of its divided definition of intoxication. Physiological biochemists are not wrong in their search. Alcohol is sedative to the dense body, and science proves that. But occult scientists find that alcohol is stimulating to the desire body. And it is that desire stimulation that we want to consider. However, before we can really get into that, we have to get into a deep metaphysical problem. We have to explore it anyway. It's easy to see how oxygen deprivation can cause staggering or slurring because those are neural functions. But how does it stimulate the desire body when the desire body is made of a completely different state of matter than the physical or even the etheric for that matter? Now there is an occult an old occult saying that goes, anything that happens on any world affects every other world. That's a fine statement, but it does little to explain how the other worlds are affected. It's a deep subject. We have very little time to go in it. And this is the first time that I'm trying to approach it. So this may be rough, and there may be areas that are not correct. Let's talk a little bit about bottom-up and top-down cosmogony and cosmology. This has been discussed quite a good deal by many spiritual philosophers, especially Pythagoras. The nature of the cosmos with different realms or different states of being or different states of consciousness is often described in terms of overtones, or better said, undertones. But let's start first with overtones. If we take a string and vibrate it, it has a pitch. If we divide that string exactly in half, the vibrating part will be at an octave of what the vibration of the whole string is. If we divide the string at other intervals, as a violinist does, it produces other pitches or tones or notes. The longer the string, the lower the note. That is to say, the more space, the more bass. And the shorter the amount of space where the time factor comes in, the more high-pitched and almost continuous the notes are. When a note is in tone, not only that note is in tone, but overtones at harmonic intervals, which are like little stopping of the strings at higher levels, are also in tone. It's almost like there's sub-vibrations on the major vibration. Works whether you're working with strings or columns of air or whatever you're using. This is how overtones are experienced. It's easy to do with a banjo or a guitar or a piano. If you intonate, especially a piano, if you intonate one string and listen very carefully, you can hear the family of harmonics up the line that are also activated. This is all basically bottom up, how overtones are produced from a larger, longer column of air, or a string in this plane produces something higher and higher until it gets to tones that we can't even hear with the human ear. Mystics claim that the cosmos, all of the worlds through which we express, is a result of undertones. That is, cosmos is created within chaos. There is a state within the absolute where what are spirit and matter as two poles of that state is so subtle that it is both spirit and matter at the same time. And that is called cosmic root substance, at least in English. There are different terms in Sanskrit and other languages. Somehow, the creative being manifests itself as an act of will within that cosmic root substance. That manifestation of will is something like an internal-external emanation. A pitch that is so high and so constant it approaches infinity. That is called either logos, or the word. Sometimes in other schools it's called nous, or the breath. Within that pervasive word that includes all of the becoming cosmos, there are internal definitions and stops. And those are where different, so to speak, vibratory levels occur. And those different vibratory levels are different levels of consciousness, each with its own character, just like a note has its own character. And each level has, it's like a full spectrum. The further into matter, or the lower the tones of the undertones, the more dense they are in terms of matter. So the different realms of consciousness, or the different worlds, represent sort of a spectrum of consciousness within the universal spirit. They are the worlds, like the physical world we're in, the desire world, the world of thought, and so on. That roughly, very roughly describes the top-down view of the creation of the cosmos. Now it's time to go back to the bottom up. Within these different worlds, which are differentiated in character, but not in detail, within these macrocosmic realms or worlds, various spiritual agencies create. They create bodies, they create other kinds of forms, and they are the vehicles of consciousness through which all the details of the creation are carried out, and through which new experience is gained. We, as human beings, can consciously manifest vehicles of consciousness in the world of thought, the desire world, in both the etheric and chemical regions of the physical world. Moreover, to some extent, we are self-consciously awake in these bodies, in these worlds. As foci of the universal spirit, which is everywhere throughout all of the worlds, we are aware of these worlds, just in the same way that the divine or the universal spirit is aware of itself through the worlds themselves. The universal spirit doesn't need bodies, doesn't need ramified bodies like us with nerves and muscles and all of that. The closest it gets to ramification is on the chemical region of the dense physical world. It manifests as planets, which are in their own way represent a spectrum of consciousness. So the universal spirit, because of its complete impersonality and because of its complete refrain from personalization, transcends itself within all the worlds by not working directly through them, but through agencies within itself. We, you might say, are the eyes and ears of God, as are the angels and all of the other creative waves of evolution. When we're self-conscious like we are, we can activate our bodies in any of the worlds that we're manifest in. And we can do these by acts of free will. And when we do so, it affects the universal spirit. The universal spirit always works top down. It's always on that universal level, and by the undertones it manifests the different worlds. To some extent, all of the agencies, the animals, the humans, and all of the beings that are working in the worlds, the collective activation is, in a large part, the activation of a realm or of a world. I don't know for certain that any given realm will be completely that. That's a possibility mythologically. We remember that Heracles lifted the globe of the universe off of the shoulders of Atlas and held it up for a while. And Atlas was going to have him hold it up forever until he found a way to trick Atlas back into taking it again. But it is this individual kind of activation that we're trying to understand in the case of intoxication. How do we activate or excite the desire body by an action on the physical world? It's a really interesting kind of thing. It can be done unconsciously and consciously. Consciously, we can excite our desire bodies by a willful act of desiring, by a willful act of emoting, that we don't need to do it, that just by our consciousness alone. That's what it means to have a desire vehicle, that we can willfully feel and that we have a full spectrum of feeling. But that's not what happens in intoxication. In intoxication, we don't willfully desire to the bar fights or whatever. So we want to look into the bottom-up unconscious activity of intoxication. What I have to say now is going to be something of an extrapolation, because I am not a seer and I cannot directly see how it works. This is how I understand it. When someone drinks alcohol, because of body heat, it vaporizes in one's body. Now, it is a chemical fact that there is an extremely strong affinity of alcohol for water. You can put an enormous amount of alcohol in a water solution. So there is that tendency that the water in our body, or that is at hand in our body, will, so to speak, absorb the alcohol into it. It is a fact to occult scientists that the life ether, that is the ether that is responsible for vital expression, cell growth, reproduction, things like that, the life ether also has a very high affinity for water. This is proven by just looking in nature. Everything that lives in nature must have water. Because if there is no water, there is no means for the life ether to express itself in the physical world, and physical world. So you see where this is going, that when one drinks alcohol, the alcohol is absorbed into water, and in that same water, there is an absorption of life ether. But as the alcohol and other things in the body are being metabolized, there is a heat reaction. And the heat that accomplishes things, or that is released, is an expression of the light ether. And so by the metabolism of alcohol and other hydrocarbons in the body, heat is built up. We have body temperature and we have warm bodies. Now, each of the four, so what we're saying is that the effect of the alcohol is now transferred in part to the light ether. Now, each of the four ethers in our etheric vital body relates to one of the realms that we manifest in. The chemical ether relates to the chemical region of the dense physical world. That's all. The only place it exists is for chemical reactions and for forms. The reflecting ether relates to the world of thought. Thoughts that we think in our mind immediately can be reflected into the reflecting ether of our etheric vital bodies and then hence into the brain. The life ether relates to the etheric plane itself. But the purpose of the etheric plane is to produce vitality. So the vitality of our vital body is primarily in the life ether. But the light ether relates to the desire world. That is to say that the light ether is a lower octave of the desire world. And as a consequence, when the light ether is excited, there is an overtone, an octave overtone of excitement in the desire body. This has been known by mystery schools of all times. For example, the Buddhists say, be very careful of the life of the senses, because sense perception in itself is one of the activities of the light ether. And if one becomes too attached or enamored with sense perception,
it awakens desire. And if you're not careful, it can awaken desires that you're not what you're wanting in your consciousness. So what we're saying is that when we take alcohol, the alcohol goes in the water, where the life ether is involved is also suspended or absorbed in it, and then by the metabolic process it gets heated up, and through the heat it gets into the light ether, and then it forms an octave relation, and the desire body is excited. And the excitement of the desire body is according to the nature of the desire body. To some extent, that if a person had only lofty desires and drank alcohol, the effect would be to excite lofty desires. In fact, it's a well-known thing among drinkers and especially among drug takers. In fact, the drugs look slightly differently, but that a maiden drug trip tells you what the nature of the soul of somebody is. That if somebody takes LSD or mescaline or a pot or something like that, the first time out, if they're nasty, it shows that when you might not be able to see it on the surface, that but beneath the surface, the desire nature of that person is a mean, nasty person, because that's what gets, because at the first stroke of it, before you learn how to control it, the first intoxication shows your nature as it is. So that's how, roughly, how the desire body is activated. So one of the things that the hierarchies did to help us come into the material world that we had committed ourselves to coming into, in ignorance we had committed ourselves, but that doesn't make any difference. We did the deed, and the deed carries out, and so we're going deeper into matter, and to help us deeper into matter, alcohol was given to us. So it's important that only Taliban and the lowlives are the ones that are deeply involved with alcohol in this way. The nobles don't require it because they've got all this ambition for power. They got the desire for the finer things in life. Now, Taliban is referred to as an Indi or an Indian as well as a mooncalf. This is partly because in Shakespeare's time, the Indies, which we now call the Caribbean islands, were a fascinating thing to Shakespeare in England. It was barely a little over a century in a much earlier, in a much more primitive time, that the New World had been discovered. And just like he said in here, boy, if we could bring them back to England, even dead people would part with a lot of money just to see an Indian, because they were fascinated by that. And the Indians, even then, were famed for their attraction to alcohol as a divine liquor, and for their genetic predisposition to alcoholism. Now we have to be very careful at this point. We are not saying that the Indians are atavisms of the people of the Lemurian epoch. But what we are saying is that the relationship to alcohol and what it does is similar. Many Indians have a clairvoyance that they are not even aware of. Like if you read some of the books of Sherman Alexie, and he talks about a common experience and knowing about things of nature or about horses or things like that the Indians have. This is a form of involuntary clairvoyance. In that regard, they are like the people of ancient Lemuria. The ancient Lemurians didn't want to come down into the material world because they were losing the Garden of Eden. And the Garden of Eden was that clairvoyance, seeing the spiritual worlds. So they didn't want to lose that. The Indians didn't want to lose that. The ancient people of the Lemurian epoch didn't want to lose it. So we find, even going against the prohibition of the hierarchies that were guiding us, we caused ourselves to come into matter. We didn't understand the extent of that first action that has so skewed our evolution and the evolution of our whole planet, our whole cosmos. We still don't really understand it. We're still very much in the dark. So we resisted coming into matter. I did this alone. Sorry. However, that did make our course different whether we wanted it or not. One of the means that the hierarchies used to bring us into the material world was alcohol. We took alcohol because it excited our desire bodies. It was a divine liquor, and it excited our desire bodies to the point that we had more of a remembrance of what it was like before we were losing the inner spiritual light as a result of our fall. However, since our desires were crude, and since we had used our desires to seek the material world, the effect of the excitement of the desires of the alcohol on the desires of the desire body was to cause us to come more into the material world. One of the effects of desire is hardening. If we indulge ourselves in desires, not even only physical desires, but even emotional desires, is that we become psychologically hard and we become physically hard. So what temporarily seemed to give us a little buzz and remembrance of the Garden of Eden gradually had the effect of closing us off. And it closed off the involuntary clairvoyance, and it kept us on the path of doing what we needed to do, which was now our cosmic duty. So it brought us into the material world. The more we came into the material world, the more we were detuned from the higher worlds, and that was another way of closing us off. This process continued through the Atlantean epoch, and it continues right down to our times. It continues until we are completely and perfectly focused right in our physical bodies, where everything is concentric, so to speak. That means we have closed off all of the hereditary clairvoyance, and we are separate, self-reliant individuals. This is symbolized in the Bible in that after the flood, which represents the end of Atlantis, Noah got drunk and he was seen nude by his children. Both facts are there that the drunkenness was still necessary, but now he could be seen. He could be seen with the eyes, and that's altogether different than carnal knowledge. We just know there's somebody out there because of some intense sensation that you don't normally have. But now you could see that he was naked. So it's a compound symbol. So intoxication brings us into the body just like it brought me to the body at the pool table. And intoxication turns off atavistic, involuntary, hereditary clairvoyance. Rudolf Steiner came from a lineage where he had hereditary clairvoyance. And so for a very brief period in his life, he drank wine, and he drank wine to intoxication until he had closed off all of those early period, the kind of clairvoyance that was more like animal clairvoyance. He wanted every bit of that out of him. And when he had done that, then he never drank wine again. he utilized the same function of nature. He used it consciously. If one follows intoxication, the desire body awakens worldly ambitions. We can see that in hard drinking people or hard working people. That's almost legendary. When one is grounded and hard working and has all of the normal desires and all of the involuntary clairvoyance is closed off, then alcohol becomes no longer necessary. It's superfluous. And to continue on then is downright destructive. If one continues with alcohol, it eventually destroys the liver. The liver is the seat of the desire body in the physical body. Destroys the center of the seed atom. In fact, if one continues on and takes larger and larger amounts of alcohol to try to awake desire body buzzes, it'll work, but it'll work in a most horrendous way. It'll awaken one in the lower regions of the desire body in what we call delirium tremens. It's a forced kind of clairvoyance that is exceedingly undesirable. So we can see that the genius, the spiritual genius of Shakespeare comes right into the coincidence of alcoholism being associated with low lives, and especially with Caliban drinking the divine liquor. We can also see that there has been, and to some extent still is, a place for alcohol and intoxication as an adjunct to all of the other means to bring a person into the world, into this deviant path of evolution that we have taken. We're here, we have to work with it. You can see how it has been an aid to us, but how we cannot continue on in the past. This is the way that evolution works. When the anaerobic bacteria killed all the heavy gases around the early Earth, it meant that only aerobic beings could survive. Anaerobics couldn't continue on. One stage of evolution produces conditions that cannot be carried on into the next stage. So alcoholism has brought us to a state of being in our senses, and it produces a state where we can no longer depend on alcohol. So it's a very beautiful way of showing the different stages of evolution through the characters of the play, right down to the little details of what their behavior is. Next time we'll try to capture all of Act 3, which I think we'll be able to do. I'm sorry that this was so long, but I just got excited by the topic, you know, it happens that way. That's right. Yep. Nope. That's later in the. You're reading my notes ahead of me. That's not fair. No. It's yeah. There was a real plot, but nobody got killed. But you're anticipating the notes. You're way ahead of the game. Cheater. You can never have a class with intuitive people because they'll always know what's coming, and you can't discover anything to anyone. It's 3 weeks. Take them on the syllabus. Right next to the chair.